So I want to thank all of you who have joined. I'm going to move to share screen at this moment and start a PowerPoint presentation in connection to our presenter as I
recording in progress.
Introduce our author, Alessandro Giorgi, whose book, The Fightìng Fathers, CIA-backed Catholic Militia in South Vietnam, has just been published by Schiffer Military. I think it was published about 2 weeks ago. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I want to thank Marquette University for their help in sponsoring this. I'm teaching the course in the history department there, Religion and Espionage. I also want to thank the International Association for Intelligence Education for putting this announcement on their listserv. This organization, of which I'm a member, is promoting intelligence education, intelligence studies, intelligence practitioners in best practices for education. We are grateful for you joining us, Alessandro, as you provide your wisdom on this very intriguing and interesting kind of micro movement within the Vietnam War, which has a lot to do with what many historians and what many intelligence studies professors are taking up in their own classes and research, and that is a new kind of historiography about where religion and intelligence fit in together. On the screen now is a graphic, a book published by the University of Chicago about 2 years ago by Michael Graziano, where he makes the case that the foundations for the CIA were planted in religious activity that or religious framing, which William J. Donovan placed into the OSS. And he kind of dug through the OSS archives and saw how Donovan framed his various international departments for intelligence contact and used Catholic sources, used kind of Vatican sources, a Vatican framework, and Catholic sources to move in a global direction. And Graziano also makes the argument that once the OSS was mothballed in the summer of 1945, members of the OSS ended up eventually working for the CIA after 1947, and they brought this same framework, in other words, this kind of ease with religion, a very cozy relationship between religious organizations, religious groups, and official intelligence apparatus of the U.S. government. That was kind of baked in to the foundational elements of the CIA due to the OSS wartime experience with religion. That book's gotten a lot of discussion, but we're not here to talk about that book. But I'm just using it as a framing for our own discussion because your research is telling you about an instance of CIA activity in the Vietnam War, where the CIA had direct contact with Roman Catholic priests who were creating and inspiring militia. So Alessandro is an author of a number of books on intelligence matters. I first met Alessandro in Boston when he was giving a lecture at the American History Center in Hudson, Massachusetts, which is a kind of a military history living military history museum. In fact, as I drove up that day, an Abrams tank was maneuvering outside of the museum or something like that, which was a sight. And he was giving his lecture underneath the wing of a B-24 bomber and across from a Scud missile, which was a very like one of the coolest places to give a speech I think you could ever give one. And now we take up this book because I'm grateful to him for speaking in connection to my class at Marquette, Religion and Espionage, where we talk about precisely these matters. So my first question, Alessandro, about your very engaging book and informative book and really wonderful book is these Fightìng Fathers. As you mentioned in your first chapter, Catholics were only 7% of the population of Vietnam in the late 50s, early 60s. So could you tell us, did these, as you call them, Fightìng Fathers, did they have, what kind of influence did they have? Who were they? And why are they worthy of our attention? And what kind of traction and influence did they have in Vietnamese society during the war and their connectivity to the CIA?
Okay, well, the Fightìng Fathers, as they were called also informally within the CIA, were active, at least at the beginning of their activity, late 50s, early 60s, in a country where the dominating clan, the ruling family, the Ngo family, was Catholic. And this, combined with the legacy of the French colonial rule, granted the Catholic minority some privileges. Although even in the Diem era, Diem was the president, de facto dictator of South Vietnam, even in the Diem era, the supply of weaponry to those communities was not immediate and very prudent. There is in the book, there is a map that shows the points in which the Fightìng Fathers program was being implemented by the CIA. Those two characters which I focused on in my book have been focused on for specific reasons, which I will mention in a minute. Let's say that why the CIA, which brings us back to espionage and religion. As many of you know, back in those years, the CIA was given the task of conducting and performing those paramilitary actions. It all, most of it changed after '63 when with the operation Switchback. Such paramilitary operations on a large scale were handed over to the military, to the Pentagon. But back then, it was the CIA who was managing and organizing these activities. The reason why I focused my research on those specific two characters is very simple. Those are the only ones that I could, on which I could give a name, a face, a profile, and a complete picture of their activity. Let's go back maybe to some of your students about the motivation behind my research in this case, as it was in the previous book about the Norwegian mercenaries in Vietnam. The events or the cases that seem unreal. Now, this thing of the Fightìng Fathers was meant to be, by the CIA in the very beginning at least, as a sort of stay-behind operation. So the build-up of an infrastructure, communication, resistance, deposits, in case of a violent communist takeover, as it was in Europe with the stay-behind operation in all the various Western countries. But before too long in Vietnam, it switched to a more offensive operation, offensive patrolling, self-defense, armed self-defense of the villages. or at least of those, not only of the Catholic minority, but specifically in the Catholic minorities. And one of the reasons that led me to research was that in the very, very few writings or testimonies about that was said, there were those Fightìng Fathers, but the most famous was a certain Father or Brother Bosco. And none of those authors who mentioned this most famous was able to give, here we see, the only picture that I know existing in the world, which is the picture in the front cover of my book, that shows Brother Bosco. You see in full black cassock of those years. I will say a word about this picture itself. And I said, hey, Bosco, Vietnam was one of the wars in which Italy didn't enter at all, even with not even with the field military hospital that we sent to Korea, not even that in Vietnam. So I said, hey, maybe we were there with a missionary, with a fighting priest, and there it began my research. The 2 or 3 authors which mentioned this, I could contact directly. I asked the question. You wrote, but the most famous was Brother Bosco. Any reason why you say that was the most famous other than citing his name? And the answer was no. So probably it was all copy and paste or just hearsay. So I said, okay, let's contact former Italian missionaries who were there in those years. Contacted a couple of them. And one of them, especially Father Geddo, was very precious for a book he gave me. And both of them said, look, San Giovanni Bosco, is a very popular saint all over the Catholic minorities in Southeast Asia. So the fact that this priest was called Bosco, is not a proof that he was Italian. It's very common that they call Bosco their son, or that a priest, once he's ordained priest, assumes the name Bosco. So this is probably the proof that he's a Vietnamese and not an Italian. When I finally contacted Jack Benefield, who was the CIA case officer in charge of those operations in that area, he told me, hey, your Italian friend, the missionary, was 100% right. Brother Bosco, here it is, was 100% pure-breed Vietnamese. And I said, look, but these neatly dressed soldiers around him don't exactly look like ragtag peasants, guerrillas. I said, no, they are the province chief, South Vietnamese province chief and his staff. And here we're back to something that Professor Gallagher and I discussed when we met in person in Hudson, Massachusetts, a couple of years ago. They had to be in the forefront. So Jack Benefield told me, we couldn't arm these peasants too well. We couldn't train them too well as we could, because otherwise the South Vietnamese official side would kick us out because we were somehow stealing the show. And that was one of the other angles to look at the Vietnam War. So the other character was...
do you buy that explanation? I mean, do you believe that? That sounds kind of like nonsense to me.
It is, but I know, for example, of an Australian advisor who was very successful in his own village of his own responsibility, and he was told off. He said, Jack Benefield told me, we always had to be very much on the background. The South Vietnamese officials said they were very jealous of their responsibility and all. You can draw your own conclusions, but that does not surprise me. That does not surprise me, because after all, Saigon, the Saigon official side always looked with some suspect to those religious and ethnical minorities, seeing them as a potential threat to the central power or for cultural reasons. So there was this mutual mistrust. It is true that in those early years, Diem was in power. Diem was a Catholic, and that was when these programs, for example, of the Fightìng Fathers, had the most continuous flow of supplies and support from the central authorities, but still with the CIA in the background, because they were in charge of these, let's say, unofficial operations. The other guy,
if I could interject, so this is Father Bosco. This is a Father Hoa, who I'll ask you to talk about later. But I think for our students, for the students and the folks on this call, I think there are a couple larger questions here. These are priests. I mean, this Father Bosco is dressed in a cassock, wearing a beret, probably French colonial influence there, but he's wearing a cross, a pectoral cross for some reason. He might even be a bishop or another rank of protonotary apostolic. And this is a Father Hoa who's actually carrying a shotgun, not military grade, but civilian grade shotgun. So the question is, like, the Council of Nicaea in 325 forbade priests to take up arms on the battlefield. On top of that, and more important still, you've got the Gospels talking about the law of love. You've got the example of Jesus healing the servant Malchus in the Garden of Gethsemane after his apostles took his ear off with a sword. You've got 2,000 years of Catholic pacifism. And then we show up in Vietnam, and the title of your book can legitimately be called The Fightìng Fathers. Now, I should tell the folks on the call, this book only looks at 2 priests. But after reading the book, these 2 priests were thoroughly involved with operational matters and of a military style in their home areas. I mean, it's extraordinary. So, like, how do you, in your writing of this book, how did you ever ask questions about how are these priests reconciling this military activity, which you can't really call it anything else?
Yeah, let's say that for what concerns Brother Bosco, he was an oblate of St. Joseph, if I remember well. He, according to Jack Benefield, he said he was very protective with his parishioners. He wanted the best for them, etc. But as far as I know, well, I don't have any other picture, but I never heard or saw or heard of him leading patrols with a gun in his hand. For Father Hoa, it was different for one very simple reason. He was a priest. He was ordained priest in 1935. But when the war between China and Japan broke out in 1937, of course, in the Chinese army, China is not a country where there is a tradition of a monotheistic religion. So he was a male, aged for military. He had a superior education. He had to be an officer. So that's where he got a military formation, a military training, and where he also matured his anti-communism, because also against the Japanese, there was already this radical division between the Kuomintang, the nationalist part of China, and the communists of Mao Zedong. So when the war ended and he was discharged, he returned to be a priest, and he was sent to the very same area.
You should let the viewers know he was discharged as a lieutenant colonel.
Yeah,
I mean, he
made some career.
So he joined the enlisted corps, and they immediately saw that he was educated. I mean, he seems like a brilliant guy. Now, my take on his career, this is just a sidebar. I'm also, truth be told, I'm a Catholic priest. I'm a Jesuit priest, so I kind of know church culture a little bit. And to my mind, he was slated to be a theology professor at a seminary. But then somewhere along the line, before he was able to go get his PhD, he must have ticked somebody off in the church, because as his star was rising, somebody clipped it, because he, as World War II broke out, he should have been either sent to Rome or the Pontifical Theologate in Manila to get his theological degree, but that never happened. And then he spent, gosh, how many years was it? Like 10 years in the Chinese Nationalist Army?
Something, yeah.
And he becomes this high-ranking officer, like he leads troops somehow he like dropped out of the church for 10 years and became a soldier, which to my mind means, what is his vocation looking like? Does he think of himself as a priest, or does he think of himself as a soldier? Because he retires or he gets discharged as a lieutenant colonel.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, from this point of view, probably, as far as I know, he's a one of a kind. We have to say that in some short clips, not pictures, but 8mm camera films that was shot with him in action, I tend to think he was grabbing his 16 shotgun. Although I have the feeling that he used it more to hunt hawks, which were perceived as a threat to the poultry of his village, rather than shooting at human people. But that doesn't really change what you said, which is absolutely right. Hey, what is your vocation? If you look at a movie like Mission, you see Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons playing the two opposite. Help them, but as a priest, not as a soldier. While Robert De Niro says, the only way I can help them against these soldiers is protecting also with my military skills. Now, both of them, at least some of them, asked official permission to the local hierarchy. Are we allowed to such activities? And they didn't have an answer, neither yes or no, because of course, although we have to keep in mind that the Archbishop of Hue was the elder brother of Diem, so the highest Catholic authority of Vietnam, was part of the family ruling Vietnam, so part of that, let's say, disputable kind of ruling of the country. But they didn't say yes. They didn't even say no, because they acknowledged that the military expertise or the dedication of these priests was the only way these peasants could be helped. Whether it was a wise decision or not, I don't know, because in the end,
let me jump in here on that.
Yep.
Just for the benefit of the students on the call. In 1926, Pope Pius XI did write an encyclical on the Mexican situation. It was at the time of the Cristero War. And it's a fascinating encyclical, because in there, he gives permission for Catholics to take up arms in a defensive posture if their homes, livelihoods, and churches are about to be overrun by what he called socialist forces. But it's this 1926 encyclical has this wild paragraph giving kind of theological permission through basically St. Thomas Aquinas for what the Pope calls legitimate defense. Like, you have Catholics have a not necessarily a duty, but they have moral permission to defend themselves. And so when I was reading about Father Hoa and his, basically Father Hoa built what we might call a strategic hamlet in the middle of a swamp in one of the worst areas of South Vietnam. And he created a defensive structure, a whole settlement, a defensive settlement. I mean, the engineering of it was amazing.
Absolutely.
But it was, what I noticed was it was entirely defensive in orientation. It wasn't really offensive. It was more about to defend against Vietcong attacks. And so I think that's where the theological piece comes in for Hoa, and perhaps for Bosco. You could say more about that. There is this kind of moral permission, basically due to the arrival of Leninist communism, which they view, from 1917 to 1927, the Catholic Church kind of views it as an existential threat to the institutional church. And so in 1926, there's this encyclical on Mexico that most scholars don't even look at, but it's got this bizarre paragraph saying, if you need to defend yourselves, you can take up arms and do it. It's wild.
Yeah, and it is worth notice that Father Hoa was given the overall coordination, not only in his area, in the southernmost tip of South Vietnam and that swampy area, was given overall responsibility not only of his own sea swallows, which identified the armed militia of Chinese or ethnic Chinese people, but also of the so-called Catholic youth, which were the Catholic of Vietnamese ethnicity, and some Buddhist militia also. So he said, it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Buddhist. What we need to defend from is from communism. So let's get together. But this means that also the other groups, not belonging to his own, acknowledged his authority. They trusted him in terms of performance, as opposed to some parts, large parts of the regular army here, Brother Bosco, but especially here, Father Hoa, which was a much larger area. The fact is that the armed men trusted the leadership until the leadership was in charge, was allowed to lead them. The results were there. And when he was set aside after Diem's death, all these programs were downscaled, not only because now there was no more a Catholic as the head of state, as the president, as the de facto dictator, but also because Westmoreland himself, the Americans, did not believe in what they called, in a derogatory way, the other war. They believed in a conventional war that was called the War of the Big Battalions. While Father Hoa was well aware of the fact that such a war could not be fought, could not be won in a conventional way. So, he was set aside, and then in later years, in the late 60s, totally discouraged. He went over to Saigon and then later on to Taiwan, where he was only a priest, nothing more. But again, the fact that the troops, if we may call them the troops, trusted the leadership explains in large part their performance until they were resupplied, until they were supported, until their program was supported by the center. And I have to add one thing in general about the performance of these militias when it was capitalized on them. I remember very well the words that a former U.S. Marine officer in the 11th Marines in Vietnam told me. The popular forces and regional forces, as opposed to the regular army, were the ones who had the best, kill ratio, but let's say the most effective, even in relationship with us, the Americans, because it was them who could tell that guy is out of place. that guy doesn't talk like someone of this village. That guy doesn't dress like someone of this area. He's out of place. Now, these subtleties is something that only such forces and these Fighting Father militias were, let's say, these popular local forces at their best, if we may say so, could spot these subtleties. And in such a war where it was difficult to tell civilians by disguised undercover Vietcongs or whatever, they were the ones who could make the difference. Now, let's not generalize. There were South Vietnamese elite forces like the Rangers, the Airborne, the Marines who performed well. But in general, in the end, eventually, it was the local forces that had the best impact. And the best of the best was these units until their leadership was allowed to operate, until their program was not downscaled and canceled, substantially canceled, because it was not seen as something to invest on for different reasons, either by the Americans and by the South Vietnamese. When it was recognized that they could be a resource, and they started to rethink about it, it was way too late.
So if I could just jump in, if you could, for our callers, could you just briefly give a general outline of the kind of order of magnitude of these units, the order of battle, if you will? Like, what could you describe them in terms of their effectiveness on a dynamic battlefield? And they're mainly operating between 1961 and 1967 eventually, but
yeah,
after
absolutely.
DM's death, it kind of gets a little shaky. But if you could just tell our callers, like, so we've got these priests, they're leading militias, but could you give us a little kind of just a snapshot of the size and the style of armament, the style of warfare that they're conducting or taking part in?
Well, let's say that basically in the area of Brother Bosco, you could number them by the hundreds, while down south, where the Sea Swallows acted and then the Catholic youth also acted, you could measure them by the thousands. The size was different, but those priests acted as, we may say, liaison officers between the locals and the Americans, the CIA officers who were were taking care of these programs. Of course, and with the South Vietnamese, when they took over the responsibility, or when they had to be involved somehow, there was a mutual mistrust between all those ethnic and religious minorities and the South Vietnamese regular army and the government officials in charge of the region, of the province, of the district. A mutual mistrust that was partially solved only much later when the damage was done, and there was nothing more left to rebuild. And let's say that it was their training was sort of search and self-defense, as you well said, but also some sort of small-scale search and destroy. They were patrolling. The guys of Brother Bosco were nicknamed the Strikers to underline their offensive nature. So it was they were patrolling the areas around them. The control of the territory was always the problem of the South Vietnamese military. The North Vietnamese generals always said, President Van Thieu and in general the South Vietnamese generals said that insufficient resources in absolute terms and insufficient resources granted by the Americans were the cause of their final defeat. But, the North Vietnamese say, in reality, their position to control and to not concede one single square inch overstretched their forces, no matter how large they were. So they're blaming a lack of resources to cover, in fact, a flawed strategy. They should have concentrated somewhere. And these forces were those that, and as opposed to that, in their area of responsibility, controlled the territory. The Viet Cong in the area of Father Hoa tried always their best to inflict the highest damage to those forces because they perceived it as a mortal threat. So they succeeded only when these programs were downscaled and were not given anymore the priority that they had in the early 60s. But they granted that control of the territory that the regular army did not and could never have. So under this point of view, the war in the villages was a matter that these units understood and interpreted in a much better way than the South Vietnamese regular army as a whole in their majority did, actually. So
yeah,
yes.
that's what if I could interject, that's what I want to get into with my last question. I think for the listeners, I think the bold claim of your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this to me, when I set it down, the bold claim of your book is that these religiously grounded, defensive, in many cases, units called Sea Swallows. Father Hoa's group was called the Sea Swallows. Yeah. And then you said Father Bosco's group was called the Strikers. They seemed to exhibit a military philosophy that was more effective on the dynamic battlefield because they kind of employed a psychological perspective, which was both local and kind of effective. That these religiously led groups were more effective than the ARVN forces that after Diem's death would come in. And I mean, I think that's extraordinary that you would say that militarily speaking, these two priests seem to be better equipped,
more effective than the generals.
than Diem's. Well, actually, Diem is dead by 63, but by President Chiu's forces. I mean, it's just, it's unclear whether whether you're extolling these kind of religious warriors or whether it's really an indictment of the regular army.
Well, let's put it this way. Motivation is the key factor, and they had either for ethnical or for religious and so cultural reasons the motivation that many other Vietnamese did not have or simply didn't care. And again, I'm again on this, they trusted the leadership and until they were resupplied in a decent way. When the leadership was removed, in this case, still when the thing was going on, Father Hoa was removed and replaced by South Vietnamese officials. Nothing wrong with the South Vietnamese themselves, but the mutual mistrust made a shambles of it all. So, and there was no turning back. There was no, well, we did it wrong. Let's reinstall Father Hoa. No. And so it all crumbled down. But for the reason of their effectiveness, as you said, is basically motivation given by also by their religious and much in a broader sense, their cultural background, which felt the others, the Viet Cong, the communists, as enemies. And let's not forget that part of them came from Kuomintang, from the nationalist China, where they had been fighting them for years, and they saw them as a deadly threat. And motivation and trust in the leadership, trust in the commanders. That's the key fact. Of course, the scale of these operations in themselves could not change the tide of the war, even if they were carried on successfully with the right people, the right supplies throughout the 60s, etc. They could not probably balance off the flaws of all the rest. But there's no doubt that they knew the terrain. There were no people coming from God knows where. They knew the terrain, they were motivated, and they trusted the leadership. That's the three, well, and not only here, in every other military ambient, or, well, in Italy, okay, let's just a little bit. In the 19th century, when with the resurgency, the country was united, the regular army of the Savoy household, who was very true to the family, did not perform so well on the battlefield, while the volunteers of Garibaldi did, because they trusted entirely their commander. There was an absolute trust on the commander, and that made all the difference, keeping the other components on the same side. You cannot fight without weapons, of course, but given that chance, okay. So what else can I say? Feel free to ask.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'll wind down. I just want our listeners to know that Father Bosco, there's very little known about how he ended up. Father Hoa, we know much more about how he ended up, but I should say that in 1964, Hoa received the Magsaysay Award, which many people may not know about, but it is referred to as the Nobel Prize of Asia. And that he received great attention in both Eastern and Western newspapers in 1964. And he was described as a Roman Catholic priest who led a fight against global tyranny in Vietnam. And he always expressed himself as a simple country priest. I mean, there's nothing simple about this guy, but he always said he was just a simple country priest. And I think he died in 1989. Is that right? Is that?
Right. Now, let's see if I.
Yeah.
But
anyway,
he died in Taiwan. But he died in Taiwan, where he was given a parish, and he did only the priest over in Taiwan. Yeah.
So can we open it up for questions if either Juan or Bill or Mario have some questions?
Yeah, I do. I'm not a student. I'm a former professor, Bill Spracher, former vice president of IAFI, and I taught at the National Intelligence University in Washington for many years, and I'm a retired Army intelligence officer. I was fascinated by the topic of this presentation. That's why I checked in. Anytime I see like Charlie teaching a class, which the title of it is Religion and Espionage, which don't seem to jive together pretty well. This is sort of a follow-up to Charlie's question about, how do you reconcile religious figures being involved in military operations? And well, it's self-defense, that's okay. My question is, since these guys were CIA backed, were they involved simply in military operations, militia operations? Were they also involved in covert operations, intelligence operations? I would think that the Pope might not smile too widely on those kinds of involvements. But what kind of research have you done, Alessandro, on any sort of intelligence linkages these priests have? Thank you.
I'll try to keep it short. Well, as far as the Fighting Fathers in Vietnam are concerned, as far as I know, I could tell you, no problem. They were involved only in that paramilitary field operations. Also because in the dispersed villages where they were, there was little less they could do. They could not do any other sort of intelligence, let's say the James Bond way. Okay, but when Professor Gallagher and I met the first time in Hudson, Massachusetts, the speech that I was giving about the black entries, the clandestine operations, the black entries beyond the Iron Curtain performed by Western powers against the Warsaw, well, not yet Warsaw Pact countries. I talked about these Catholic and Orthodox priests and nuns who did perform intelligence operations willingly. But again, make no mistake about it, they were not on anybody's payroll. They did it because they felt they were doing the right thing, providing information, providing intelligence to the outside in order for the local resistance. We're talking about Western Ukraine, and we're talking about Balkan countries, etc. And there were the bishops doing intelligence, and especially for Ukraine, the Ruthenian Catholics and the Greek Catholics, which were the Orthodox who came back to the Roman Catholic Church some centuries ago, the local nuns were the real active case officers on the field officers to provide information. And that's another fascinating story. In the end, Bishop Romja was killed, was murdered in hospital with a lethal injection administered by a nurse who was in fact a KGB agent infiltrated, who replaced the nuns who were officially taking care of the bishop. They didn't know that she was a KGB agent, and killed the Bishop Romja, which was really felt as a pain in the head by Khrushchev, who was the local chief in Ukraine, and Stalin at the time would not have forgiven that he would let this bishop act freely for much longer. And the Western, in particular American intelligence, were drawing part of their information in supporting the anti-Soviet Ukraine guerrilla through these religions of the Ruthenian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox confession of that part of Ukraine. That's another fascinating story. We were there. I'm hoping to get a book out about this before too long, at least in Italian. Then I will turn it into an English edition. But if you want, I can talk about it with you or in another occasion, as long as you want. Charles was there, and we had a great time together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.